So in this video I'm going to show you the process I took turning this little guy into a full animal world style scene using Godot. So first you start off with the little guy. If we look at the order of layers, there's first like this background layer which is always there, then there's this foreground which is like all the main props, and there's the midground which is sort of like filling in the little details of the world. There's usually some particles on screen. Then there's the water, which really gives a lot of the vibe of the game, the waterfalls and the lakes. And there's the light, and then there's the CRT effect. So I'll just be going through how I created each one of these layers and what the process of recreating all these effects was like in Godot. So hopefully you find it interesting and useful. So what I started with was creating some of the textures and art assets, and I won't lie, I was directly sampling the colors from some reference material because honestly that's just the easiest way to get like an accurate color palette. So then once I had this basic like brick pattern and the columns as well, then I set up like a simple tile map layer node and then just painted in like a basic environment which allows the little guy to run around. But before the little guy can run around, I need to add player movement. So keeping it super simple, well actually maybe that jump is a little bit too high, and no, he needs to be able to get off of the ground please. Alright, and there we have it. After a little bit of tweaking, got something that's close enough to allow the little guy to explore the environment. And I guess the focus of the video is going to be more on the art style anyway, so the controller doesn't have to be perfect. So Animal World has like a really pretty CRT effect, which seems to have been implemented a bit differently to a lot of other CRT effects. If we zoom in on one pixel, which at 1080p is a 6x6 sub-pixel grid, then we can see how much variation there is. Looking down the rows, you can see the scanline effect is created by gradually darkening the lower and higher sub-pixels. Also, I believe there's a horizontal and not a vertical blur, which just takes the average of the 5 sub-pixels in a row to get the value for the sub-pixel in the center. This means that the sub-pixels in the center rows are unaffected, but the ones towards the edge become more influenced by the neighboring pixel. So the way I started off making the scan lines was using Desmos actually to create like a sine wave function and to test out what values I'd need to set to make sure it repeats perfectly per each pixel. In the end though, I just used a step function, which was much simpler but technically won't be correct at different resolutions, but it's just a demo so it's good enough for now. And Animal World has this really pretty outline effect, which you can see is around the edges of all of the tile maps. And so my scene setup is a little weird for this, but basically to make the tile map one object, I put it under a sub viewport, and then that gets rendered to a sprite, so then I can apply a shader to that sprite, and you treat the tile map as like one object, or the shader does anyway. So for the outline effect, we do this through a shader, and basically for each pixel you just need to check its neighbors, and if the alpha value of all of its neighbors is greater than 0, then you know that it's not on the edge. And if you look at its neighbors and some of them have a 0 alpha value, then you know it is on the edge. So then you fill it with a different color or apply whatever effect you want to. So after getting the outline test working, then I basically just apply that to the brightness values for each pixel. So the outline ones get brighter and the inner ones get slightly darker. So Animal World makes use of a lot of noise patterns through the shaders, and it really makes the world come alive when the noise patterns like evolve over time and just everything's like in motion. So basically the next step was sort of add a bit of that noise pattern to the background tiles. So basically what I'm doing here is just multiplying the noise by the color values and just making them darker in certain areas. I've eventually changed the approach to do more of a stepped pattern because I think it looks closer to the retro style of Animal World. So then I'm also just making sure the noise is actually pixelated, because when you're doing a 1080p shader on top of a low-res game, you might have to just manually constrain the values and basically just round everything off to the nearest pixel. And then so this is sort of the final result of that shader. There's a few different layers, so there's the really dark, there's the mid-dark, and then there's sort of the more bright normal colors, and I think this is the sort of effect that he's used in a few different scenes. Particle effects are such a cheat code for adding that extra bit of motion and movement to a game, and if there's a common theme in the scenes across Animal World, it's that nothing is ever static. If you focus on any single pixel in the game, it'll always slightly be changing over time, and adding like a little snow or particle effect really adds to that motion. And lighting is another key contributor to the overall mood of the game. It's so dark and scary and unknown, and having a few lights sprinkled around the place goes a long way towards creating that atmosphere that immerses the player in the deep dark underground of the Animal World. So yeah, just using Godot's 2D light system to create some basic lights. Water and reflections have to be one of those like universally beautiful things, and it's always satisfying to see a nice water reflection even in a simple 2D game. The shader for this is fairly simple. All I need to do is read the screen, and then at a certain Y level we're just reflecting the pixels above it, so it's really simple. You just invert the UV Y coordinates, and then you just read the pixel back, and then you apply some modification on top of that, so you tint it a little bit to give it that like watercolor, and then you also apply like a sine wave offset to give it the ripples. And the way I've done this as well is basically make the ripples increase the further down the water is, which is implying that it's like closer to the camera or closer to the player. So the other water element that's really common in Animal World is the waterfalls. So to do these, it's actually probably one of the more complicated shaders, but basically you read the screen behind, and then we want to offset all of the values by a little sine wave, and then on top of that you also want this like waterfall noise pattern. So I was referencing the book of shaders, which has this like super simple noise example. I was just figuring out how to get those little lines to like come down on top of the also offset background. And then I was also just playing around with bloom, because who doesn't love a good old post-processing layer? And you can definitely go over the top, and obviously Animal World's a pretty dark game, so you don't want too much brightness and saturation in there, but it's still fun to look at. So then the last few steps are really just to fill out the environment, to add some more objects and just things to the scene. So I'm really just copying some of the common items found in Animal World, so not too much to say here apart from the fact that every scene in Animal World is like beautifully designed and laid out. If I had more time, I would have loved to add some of the plant life, which honestly is probably one of the like most critical pieces of the puzzle, but just thinking about having to animate plant leaves made my brain hurt, so maybe I will save that for another time. So now onto the final layer, which is the background. And this is pretty simple, to be honest. It's like mostly just a bit of noise, but yeah, I basically used a sprite to generate this, and again stealing the color palette from Animal World, just used like the shading tools and the spray paint brush to just generate like these big cloud sort of looking shapes and textures. And then pulling that into Godot, I then apply a shader on top of that, which basically just warps it around using some sine waves as is traditional. So that basically finishes up that background layer, which really I think adds a lot to the character of the scene and makes it feel really alive, especially having that extra layer of movement that's sort of off into the distance. So that pretty much wraps up the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in looking at the project, you can find the source code on my GitHub, and I'm just going to leave this running in the background. Okay, cool, bye.